A. Apple begins with the letter A. Aeroplane begins with the letter A. B. Banana begins with the letter B. Ball begins with the letter B. Balloon begins with the letter B. C. Car begins with the letter C. Chocolate begins with the letter C. Camera begins with the letter C. D. Dog begins with the letter D. Dinosaur begins with the letter D. Drink begins with the letter D. E. F. Elephant begins with the letter E. Ear begins with the letter E. Earth begins with the letter E. F. Farm begins with the letter F. Fish begins with the letter F. Face begins with the letter F. G. Glasses begin with the letter G. Goat begins with the letter G. Gift begins with the letter G. H. House begins with the letter H. Hat begins with the letter H. Horse begins with the letter H. I. Insect begins with the letter I. Ice cream begins with the letter I. Ice begins with the letter I. J. Jacket begins with the letter J. Jellyfish begins with the letter J. Juice begins with the letter J. K. Kitten begins with the letter K. Key begins with the letter K. Kitchen begins with the letter K. L. Light begins with the letter L. Leg begins with the letter L. Lake begins with the letter L. M. Money begins with the letter M. Medicine begins with the letter M. Monkey begins with the letter M. N. Nose begins with the letter N. Nappy begins with the letter N. Nest begins with the letter N. O. Oranges begin with the letter O. Ocean begins with the letter O. Oven begins with the letter O. P. Pig begins with the letter P. Peas begin with the letter P. Party begins with the letter P. Q. Qu. Quacker begins with the letter Q. R. R. Rain begins with the letter R. Road begins with the letter R. Rabbit begins with the letter R. S. S. Squirrel begins with the letter S. Sand begins with the letter S. Salad begins with the letter S. T. T. Tree begins with the letter T. Toy begins with the letter T. Tomato begins with the letter T. U. Umbrella begins with the letter U. Urchin begins with the letter U. Unicycle begins with the letter U. V. Vegetables begins with the letter V. Violin begins with the letter V. Van begins with the letter V. W. Watermelon begins with the letter W. Whale begins with the letter W. Water begins with the letter W. X. X. Xylophone begins with the letter X. X-ray begins with the letter X. Y. W. Yogurt begins with the letter Y. Yo-yo begins with the letter Y. Yoga begins with the letter Y. Z. Z. Zebra begins with the letter Z. Zip begins with the letter Z. Zoo begins with the letter Z.
Wow!